Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 30th of June of 2024. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kharkiv direction. The Russians are very active in Zolochiv area. As you can see, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians published additional videos on additional geolocations of how they were hunting and attacking Ukrainian positions, Ukrainian military infrastructure in this area. According to different sources, this is possible third direction of Russian offensive that the Russians are going to conduct within the next few weeks. Now let's move further. In the vicinity of Gluboka, we stop receiving any updates from this territory, just regular artillery duels, regular FPV drones duels, and nothing more. In this video, for example, we can see how the Russians, as a result of reconnaissance operation, managed to discover another Ukrainian mortar position, and as a result of counter-artillery duel, that mortar position of Armored Forces of Ukraine was destroyed. Now let's move further. We're going to Vovchansk direction, where we received during the previous night and the previous 24 hours significant number of different details and updates. And the most important piece of news is that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to enter the Vovchansk citadel and to establish complete control over at least 3 buildings inside of this area. As you can see, we have adjusted the map. This is the territory that was captured by the Russians. 2 buildings along Korolenko Street, the building number 52 and 54, and we have control over the building 30 and 38 along Saborная Street. So these 3 high-rise buildings were captured. The Russian sources published the video of another offensive operation. In this video we can see 3 or 4 Russian stormtroopers were heading from one building inside of Volchansk towards another, how the Russians were taking under control the first building along Saborная Street. Very heavy clashes, very heavy explosions, lots of explosions. If you have access to the map, you can hear that machine guns from Ukrainian side and from the Russian side didn't stop even for a second. And after the Russians crossed the streets, they entered the high-rise building itself. So the Russians were moving along this road. Later, the Ukrainian forces published also the video from their side. In this video, we can see how the Ukrainian FPV drone operators were FPV droning the Russians inside of Vovchansk and Vovchansk region. For example, in this moment, let's just wait a second. In this video, in this episode, we can see how the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians in high-rise building area. This is these buildings along Korolenko Street, so 56 and 54. So these 2 videos confirm that the Russians entered Vovchansk citadel itself and captured first buildings in this area. These reports we got this morning, and some of them we received yesterday in the evening. So most likely during the previous day, the Russians managed to improve their positions even more and maybe to capture additional buildings in this area. Maybe tomorrow, and before the next video, we're going to receive additional updates about additional Russian progress inside of this territory. I'll just remind you that yesterday we discussed the Russian attack along the Karaltsova Street, this one. The Ukrainian sources published the video of 57th Brigade of how they managed to block the Ukrainians inside of the citadel by armored vehicles, and the Ukrainians were trying to unblock themselves with a significant number of FPV drone strikes. So what did happen? The Russians on Karaltsova Street reached this intersection of the Metalista Street and Karaltsova Street, and in this area to establish complete control over this territory. On the other hand, during the previous 24 hours, we got significant number of videos of how the Russians were attacking the Ukrainians from the south in direction of, from the north in direction of the southern area of southern Vovchansk. The Ukrainians were bombing the Russians with mortars and artillery, and summarizing everything, we can make a conclusion that the Russians were moving something like this. Also, the Russians managed to establish control over some buildings, territories, and the streets. And of course, the Russians captured or established complete physical or fire control over the intersection of Korolenko Street and Alesia Dosvitnova Street. So by these 2 controls, by these 2 areas, the Russians cut the last supply road that Ukrainians were using to support their forces inside of the citadel. After probably a day or 2 of complete blockade, the Ukrainians become exhausted. They lost their munition, they lost everything, and the Russians began offensive. So this is the current situation. We can make a conclusion based on the geolocations and videos we received that the battle for the stronghold, for the citadel, is about to be finished. After that, the Russians will reach the operational space of low-rise building areas, and then the days of north of chance will be numbered. On the other side, we continue receiving reports from the Ukrainian sources of how they were counterattacking the Russians from the southern part in direction of the northern part, but the Russians controlled the entire situation. Today we got another video of how another concentration of Ukrainian forces tried to cross the Vovcha River, but they were discovered by the Russians and attacked by artillery. According to the group of forces north, during the previous 24 hours, the Ukrainians, as a result of all these attempts to cross Vovcha River, lost around 25 soldiers. Now let's move further, and we are going to Kupiansk direction. We have a lot of very interesting details from the southern Kupiansk area, where the Ukrainians managed to restore control over some additional positions. More precisely, in this area, we can see the work of 12 separate purpose brigade Azov. During the previous days, during the previous probably week, they managed to restore or to improve their positions along this rich network of the fortifications. The Ukrainians managed to restore control over this small part of Kremenная forest, and the Ukrainians of 12th Brigade managed to improve their positions along Seversky Donetsk River. All these attacks were conducted by the Ukrainians with the purpose to unblock those Ukrainians who are currently located along Seversky Donetsk River bank of the river in the northwestern part of Bilogorovka. So the Ukrainians here are blocked, probably, as I understand, and these attacks by the 12th Brigade, the main purpose of these attacks to unblock the Ukrainians of 81st Air Mobile Brigade and to allow them to evacuate towards Grigorovka or further in direction of Serebyanka. So this is not like an attempt from Azov Brigade to capture Privilya or to attack Lysychansk. This is just a small tactical operation to unblock forces in the vicinity of Bilogorovka. Now we are moving in direction of Siversk, more precisely to the village by the name of Sporne. One of the most interesting, let's say, probably weird villages since the beginning of the special military operation. Today, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that the units of the group of forces south or Yuk managed to establish complete control over this territory and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. We discussed this village probably hundreds of times, and once again, to increase the numbers since the beginning of May, we're gonna see that the Russians were over-focused in this village. Basically, if we zoom in very close to the surface, we're gonna see that the Russians during the previous 2 months damaged or attacked or destroyed every single building, every single basement, every single structure, every single fortification, with significant number of drones, of aviation, of artillery strikes, of Tuzlan tower strikes. There is not even a single square centimeter that wasn't attacked by the Russians during the previous 2 months. So basically, the Russians reduced this territory completely to ruins, and after that, the Ukrainians realized that under such a heavy pressure, they don't have any chances to hold this territory longer, and just to save the personnel, they decided to fall back further, back in direction of Ivanovka and the stronghold that located behind Ivanodarivka. This is the very big stronghold, as you can see. So this is the current situation. I'll just remind you that during the previous week, the Russians reported that they captured Razdolovka and continue moving further in direction of Pereizhny and Kuzminovka. Also, we have reports that the Russians continue improving their positions along the railways between Berestorovo, Bilogorovka and Vyimka. And now the Russians, of course, will continue moving further from Sporne towards Ivanodarivka and then towards this stronghold. Of course, we continue receiving reports about very heavy clashes in the vicinity of Verkhnyokamyanska, and now we have reports about very heavy clashes between Seversky Donetsk River and Bilogorovka Hills. So this is the current situation. Once again, I'll repeat one of my idea that most likely Seversk is not going to be the main battle of summer military campaign. This is probably going to be the main battle of early autumn or middle autumn military campaign of 2024. But most likely before December or even before November, the Russians are planning to capture this territory and to reach, let's say, the first eastern outskirts of the town, of the heart of Donbas Khark operation. Now we are moving further in direction of Chasiv Yar. We have additional reports, but as for any changes on the ground, we haven't received anything. The forces of 98th Division published additional video of how they were bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions inside of the Chasiv Yar citadel, which confirms that the Ukrainians still control this territory, and that on the other hand it confirms that the Russians are not in a hurry. They try probably to exhaust the Ukrainians not just in the Chasiv Yar but also in the central Chasiv Yar, because according to different sources more or less reliable, the Russians managed to cross the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass river, and currently there are very heavy clashes inside the forest by the name of Orlova. So in this area, so most likely the Russians are focused here, and they're using this eastern Chasiv Yar citadel, let's say something like the area that Ukrainians always send additional reinforcement, and then these reinforcements being bombed by the Russian self-infrared systems. So another, let's say, point on the map that where Ukrainians suffer significant losses. Now we are moving to Toretsk agglomeration. We have lots of very important updates and details. Some Russian sources adjusted their map, showing additional progress, or just adjusted the current status inside of the village by the name of Pivdenne. As we discussed during the previous days, the Russians managed to break through the Ukrainian defense belt and to improve their position significantly. But the most important updates are coming from the town by the name of New York. During this morning, we have already discussed this video. For example, in this video, we can see how the Russians bombed the central part, the industrial zone of New York, with FAB 3000. And to telling the truth, this is one of the most important events that took place in this direction during the previous 24 hours. I'll try to explain to you. Later, we got another video of the same episode, but from another angle. The Russians bombed the industrial zone of New York with FAB 3000. If you remember, we talked a lot during the previous days about this new type of weapon and about the carriers, the number of carriers that the Russians have for these purposes. And based on the open source information, I made a conclusion that the Russians currently have not more than 2 carriers that can that can use and that can carry FAB 3000. And I'll remind you that since the beginning of the Kharkiv offensive operation, we got probably 4 or 5 videos of FAB 3000 strike, and most of them took place in Liptsy village by the name of Liptsy, and probably one strike was inside of Volchansk. So the majority of strikes took place in Kharkiv direction. Then there was a short operational pause, probably in 2 or 3 days, and now we received the first geolocation inside of New York. What does it mean? That means that the Russians, due to the lack and due to the limited number of carriers, redeployed the only 2 or probably 1 of 2 FAB 3000 carrier in, let's say, Lugansk or Donetsk direction. So somewhere here. The Russians have a keep of at least 1 Su-34, maybe much further on the territory of main Russia. It doesn't matter. The thing is that now this Su-34 that can carry FAB 3000 operates on Toretsk, New York direction. And this is very important because we discussed that Su-34 and FAB 3000, the current configuration, the current number of these, let's say, carriers can't, let's say, change the entire situation along the entire line of combat contact, but these carriers can change the situation on one direction. And the thing is that, the fact that the Russians move Su-34 with FAB 3000 on Toretsk, New York direction means that they redeployed one of the most powerful, one of the most modern and new type of weapon exactly in this area, which confirms that the Russians do have very, very big plans regarding this territory. And of course, most likely the Russians are planning to capture this territory also during 2024. Just to remind you that the Russians currently are moving in the southern part of New York towards the northern part and the central part. We had update about this situation during the previous few days. Now we have report that the Russians managed to capture the village by the name of Pivdenne, and then now they reach the operational space and they can move further in the western direction towards the village of Nilipovka. And today the Russians published significant number of videos of how they were bombing the main industrial zone and the main area of concentration and temporary positions of the Ukrainians inside of this city as well. So all these things confirms that the Russians probably are planning to encircle New York, or to make an attempt to do this this summer or maybe even autumn military campaign. Now let's move to the western Avdiivka direction. We have significant number of details and updates, and we can make a conclusion based on the geolocation indications and reports we got during the previous 24 hours that Ukrainian defense, Pokrovsk defense collapsed. The Russians managed to break through and Ukrainians are running away, and nobody can't stop or slow down the Russians right now. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that as a result of clashes, the Russians established complete control over the village by the name of Novoalexandrovka. So we have adjusted the territory, adding additional 3 lines and fortifications under complete Russian control. But according to different mappers, Novoalexandrovka was captured probably a week ago or something like this, and most likely during the previous week the Russians have been conducting something like a clearing operation or something like this, and starting of today and yesterday we got lots of geolocations and posts of fire anomalies between Timofeevka, Vozdvizhenka and Baranovka. So by the time the Russians clear Novoalexandrovka, the first and edge Russian squads are ready to begin offensive further in the western direction with the purpose to capture Vozdvizhenovka. So most likely during the next week or next few weeks we're going to start receiving the first updates about this territory as well. But once again, the most important things are that the Russians are moving from Ocheretino further in the western direction towards Progress. During the previous 24 hours we got lots of mappers updates. This is the deep state update that confirms that the Russians captured almost everything between Yevgenievka, Sokol and Novoalexandrovka, the fields, railways, fortifications, strongholds. Lots of positions were captured by the Russians, and due to such a fast progress we can make a conclusion that most likely the Ukrainians are basically retreating without showing any resistance to the Russians. So this is, for example, the area in the vicinity of Sokol. As you can see, additional progress by the Russians. The Russians captured Sokol completely according to these changes on map by pro-Ukrainian sources and neutral sources as well. Furthermore, some Russian sources, some pro-Russian resources reported more precisely the Telegram channel, official Telegram channel of the Group of Forces South. So we have official channel, for example, of Group of Forces North. They gave us lots of updates, and we also have the Group of Forces South, the official Telegram channel. And today they stated somewhere at 3 p.m. of the local time that the Russians, as a result of offensive operation, managed to establish complete control over the village by the name of Yevgenievka. So as you can see, the Ukrainians lost the next defense belt, and now they are forced to fall back further to Vovchi and Progress. And this is already almost the outskirts of Pokrovsk. So the Ukrainians have significant problems, as you can see. Furthermore, due to this progress, if this information is confirmed regarding the Russian control over Yevgenievka, most likely the Ukrainians from Novosilovka Persha will be also forced to fall back without showing any resistance and without any clashes with the Russians. So the situation is very complicated. And of course, the situation between Yevgenievka, Yasnobrodovka and Karlovka. Also, we have reports, according to some Russian reliable sources, that this territory was completely captured by the Russians until the Durna River, and now the Russians managed to maintain the line of combat contact between Umanska, Durna River and Yasnobrodovka. Furthermore, we have geolocation confirming that the Russians entered Karlovka area. This is very weird and very significant progress because there is a water barrier, Balka Domina. This is something like a river, and it's a perfect, let's say, situation, perfect position, terrain position for the Ukrainians to create defense, not to allow the Russians to cross the water barrier. But due to the geolocations and due to the reality, we see that currently the Russians have no problems to cross anything. If they need, they can cross even an ocean in any direction for any purposes, because it was a perfect position once again, but the Russians managed to bypass this area without any resistance from the Ukrainian side. The Ukrainians were trying to slow down the Russians with FPV drones, but that was already done on the Ukrainian side of Balka Domana. So the Russians entered the final part of the Karlovka, and now the Russians are trying to improve their positions further in the western direction towards Centralna Street. So the main question, of course, when we see so many events, such a big progress from the Russian side, the question we have, how did it happen? How did it happen? Why the Ukrainians are retreating? Why the Russians are so fast? And what kind of mistake the Ukrainians made in the past that led now to this situation? And the answer to this question is very simple. For these purposes, we just need to increase the numbers of this since the beginning of May. And then you're gonna see everything. And what you're gonna see? You're gonna see hundreds of armored vehicles that were destroyed by the Russians during just 2 months. We are not talking about the situation from March or February or January. Hundreds of Max Pro, Bradley, Strikers, Leopards, Abrams, T-72, T-64, Kazakh, and different types of UPR, Senators, lots of weapon, lots of equipment, lots of big numbers, hundreds, I believe, I'm telling you, hundreds of geolocations, hundreds of strikes on Ukrainian positions, on Ukrainian vehicles during the previous 24 hours. And as we discussed, the main reason of these losses is that Ukrainians are stuck in this artillery pocket between Karlovka Water Reserve, between these rivers, and they stuck with significant number of Western weapons, and basically they didn't have enough of time for evacuation. And when they started the evacuation, it was too late, and the Russians basically destroyed everything on march during the movements. And now the Ukrainians have another problem. First, they lost significant number of armored vehicles during the battle for Pokrovsk in the western part of Avdiivka. But the Ukrainians do have some, of course, stocks, some extra, let's say, munition, extra equipment that they can use, let's say, for replacement of the defeated and damaged brigades and many other purposes. But the thing is that most of these armored vehicles were located or are located in the western part of Ukraine as far as possible from the line of combat contact. And when time comes, when the situation is critical, the Ukrainians use railways for the deployment of their reinforcements, including western weapon and armored vehicles from the western part of Ukraine towards the eastern part of Ukraine. And the thing is that I don't know why the Ukrainians decided that the Russians don't see or the Russians will not use the situation. I don't know why the Ukrainians think they can do this. But today, for example, the Russian sources published the video how they managed to discover another convoy, another echelon of Ukrainian tanks. Take a look at this photo. We can count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and there was 8 tanks in one convoy on the railway station in the town by the name of Vilnyansk, and the Russians attacked this convoy with Iskanders. And the source, the author of this video, reported that as a result of strike, the Ukrainians lost a significant number of armored vehicles and tanks, and they were basically damaged. But the problem and the main thing is that this is not the only video of the type that we received during the previous 24 hours. Yesterday, a bit further in the southwestern direction, in the village by the name of Ukrainka, the Russians published another video of another convoy with trucks, with engineering equipment, with just carriers that the Ukrainians were also sending to in the eastern Ukraine with the purpose probably to slow down the Russians. And as a result of another Iskander strike, another batch of reinforcement equipment was destroyed. So 2 days, 2 strikes, significant number of losses. The Ukrainians are losing their equipment, let's say, in echelons. But the main problem and the interesting thing that most of the equipment were destroyed. These 2 episodes took place along the railways from Zaporozhye in the eastern direction. If we take a look at the railways, we're going to see that the railways are moving towards Pokrovsk. This is, for example, the first line that goes to Pokrovsk. This is the second through Sinelnikova. The second through Pavlograd also moves to Pokrovsk. The next line through Lazovo goes to Slaviansk, Kramatorsk, and also from the same Lazovo, the railways goes to Kharkiv. So some town, either Kharkiv or Kramatorsk, Chasiv Yar or Pokrovsk haven't received a very big a few big batches of vehicles that were destroyed by the Russians. And this is another important thing. And another important thing is that you see that Ukrainians are not counting their losses. It can mean just one thing, that the situation on the line of combat contact is so critical, so the Ukrainians are sending forces without taking in account the risks, because they understand that for them, for example, it's better to use 100 tanks, but to bring, let's say, 50 to the line of combat contact to stabilize the situation, than not to send everything and not to send everything, but to save 150 tanks. So they don't count losses. So one day, one strike, the second day, another strike. So if the Ukrainians continue the same way, we're going to see more and more strikes during the next days, while the Ukrainians are redeploying the reinforcements from the western parts to the eastern part of Ukraine. And most likely, we discuss 4 railways directions, but as I understand, the Ukrainians are sending forces to Pokrovsk just to slow down the Russians and not to allow them to get this city. And because if the Ukrainians lose Pokrovsk, this is going to be disaster. And this is going to be probably the beginning of the final chapter of, even not the final chapter, but the final paragraph of the battle for Ukraine. Now let's move further. As we discussed, Yasnobrodovka, Karlovka, additional Russian progress. South Donetsk direction, we haven't received anything, just few updates from Krasnogorovka that Ukrainians currently are withdrawing their positions in the eastern citadel towards more reliable positions. As for South Donetsk direction, just regular activity, counter-artillery duels, FPV drone strikes, and that's it. We continue receiving significant number of updates from Prichistovka. As we discussed, since the beginning of the special military operation, there were few towns that were under very heavy Russian fire and under very heavy Russian focus. We are talking about the village of Sporna. The Russians have been bombing this territory probably for maybe 10 months in a row. Novomikhailivka was under very heavy Russian fire, probably since the beginning of the creation of that configuration. And Prichistovka is becoming the third town that is under very heavy fire from the Russian side. In the first 2 cases, at the end, the Russians captured those settlements. As for Prichistovka, I believe that the Russians are about to launch their offensive in this direction as well. Let's make some drawings because it will give us better understanding. The Russians, as I understand, are planning to do something like this. First, to maintain the line of combat contact between Pavlovka, Novomayorskaya, Shevchenkova and Prichistovka to capture this territory. And if they can do this, this will open them chances and window of opportunity to move further in the direction of Novoukrainka. And from this Novoukrainka, the Russians can move further in the direction of Bagayavlenka. And the same story we can see right now in the vicinity of Novomikhailivka. Don't forget that the Russians are moving towards Vadiana, and during the previous weeks we got a lot of updates about this progress, and most likely the Russians are planning to get there. So this is something like 2 pincers of one offensive operation, the main purpose of which is to capture Vuhledar or to encircle from 2 directions. Most likely the Russians are not planning to storm Vuhledar in front. They will try to do this through Prichistovka, Novoukrainka, and of course through Stepnoye, Vadiana, something like this, and then to create a cauldron or to force the Ukrainians to fall back. So we'll see. But the only thing that I must say about the Russian focus and concentration, the Russians spent probably in some cases up to 8 months since the beginning of big focus over this or that territory until they began offensive. It's like the same about Sporny and Novomikhailivka. The Russians been bombing all these 2 towns for probably from 5 till 8 months before they captured them. So Prichistovka is under very heavy fire just for second month. So maybe it's just like a wishful thinking or something like this from my side, and maybe that's just the beginning of the pass until the Russians are able to do or to achieve some significant results. As for Velika Novoselivka, nothing important, just regular activity is the same as in the Zaporozhye direction, just the regular activity. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.